Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation.
I want to live now more than I ever did in my life, but not from a selfish standpoint. This war has taught me many things, and now I want to live to do whatever good possible. But if I am killed any time in the war, I will not be afraid to die, and you may know that I will die like a man should, feeling that it is the greatest death a man can die.
That was Mark Trapp, author of A Destiny of Greatness, Kiffin Rockwell and the Boys Who Remembered Lafayette, quoting Kiffin Rockwell. Rockwell was 21 years old when World War I began, and he was one of the first Americans to volunteer to fight for France. He initially joined the French Foreign Legion and later became one of the first Americans in the famed Lafayette Escadrille. Today, we will talk with Mark about Kiffin Rockwell and the Boys Who Remembered Lafayette. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
So why don't you start us off with a background sketch of Kiffin Rockwell prior to World War I?
The first thing you should know is Kiffin comes from a long stock of preachers and soldiers, and I did a lot of genealogical research for the book and was interested to learn that his genealogy on both sides, the maternal and the paternal, sort of goes like this: preacher, soldier, preacher, soldier, preacher, soldier. So it just sort of swapped generations. And he had a lot of soldiers and preachers in his ancestry. His father was a popular poet and Baptist preacher and died just before Kiffin's first birthday. So that's another, I think, very important fact to know about Kiffin. And his brother Paul and his sister Agnes, as they were raised by a single mother before the turn of the 20th century. And that fact had a huge impact on his life. He was largely raised by his single mother and his maternal grandparents. His mother was a teacher, and somebody could write a book about her as well. She was a pretty amazing woman. She raised the kids. She taught them. She taught in a school there in Newport, Tennessee, which is where Kiffin Rockwell was born. She became the principal of the school that was established there. And when Kiffin's older brother, Paul, he was sort of a sickly child, or frail, let's say, and he received some treatment from a visiting osteopathic physician, and that sort of caught Lula's attention and fancy, and she decided that she would go to medical school and become an osteopathic physician. And so she went to Missouri with Paul for him to get treatment and for her to go through medical school, and she did. During that time, Kiffin and his sister largely lived with the maternal grandparents in South Carolina, where Kiffin grew up, as he had in Eastern Tennessee, fishing, hunting, horseback riding, handling guns, and becoming basically an outdoorsman. And when Lula was his mother, and when she graduated from medical school, she set up with partners with a doctor in Asheville, North Carolina, and that relocated the family to Western North Carolina. And she was almost certainly the first female osteopathic physician in the state of North Carolina, and finished raising the family there. And from there, Kiffin went on to attend Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And then after receiving an appointment to the Naval Academy, turned it down and transferred to Washington and Lee University, also in Lexington, Virginia, with his brother, Paul. Skip ahead just a bit. He and Paul both ended up in Atlanta, Georgia, right at the turn of 1914, with Paul was working for a newspaper down there called the Atlanta Georgian. And Kiffin got a job with an advertising agency there that would become one of the largest advertising agencies in the South. And that's where they were during 1914, shortly before World War I broke out.
How does he respond to the start of World War I, and how does he end up in the French Foreign Legion?
Well, they did have some French ancestry, and they were Paul was quoted one time as saying, his mother, like I said, was a teacher and had raised the boys with this respect for the French and for Lafayette in particular, and for what he had done when America was fighting for its own independence in the Revolutionary War. And I guess at that time, a lot of most Americans were raised with this respect for Lafayette as sort of on a par with founding fathers. And Kiffin and Paul certainly were. Paul said something like, I learned as soon as I could read to respect the French and Lafayette and his comrades. And so they had this idea that we Americans owed a debt of gratitude to France. And when France was threatened this way by Germany, they both felt that it was sort of their duty to go to help out and to repay this debt. Well, in a lot of the writing, Paul wrote about Kiffin quite a bit and always built him up. I don't think he needed any extra building up, but Paul did that nonetheless. And they wrote a letter to the French consulate in New Orleans dated August 3rd, 1914, which shows you how immediate their response was. And Paul actually signed the letter offering services to the French in this war. He always gave credit, and in his book said that Kiffin wrote the letter and signed it. But I actually got the letter from the French consulate and tracked it down, and it shows that Paul Rockwell signed it. But they both did offer their services, and they immediately left without even telling their mother in Asheville that they were leaving. Kiffin wrote a letter to her the night before they boarded an ocean liner from New York City on August 6th. He wrote his mother a letter and said, well, I wish we could have stopped by and told you, but we're heading to France, and this is a big adventure, and I don't want to miss out on it. And so he said he felt the call of opportunity, and they left the next day and went to France. They were probably the first Americans to leave America to go fight in the war.
Tell us about his service in the French Foreign Legion.
Well, there were, Paris in August of 1914 must have been one of the most incredible dates and places in the history of the world. Like if you could pick a place to observe or to peek in on, that would be one of the places I would like to see or experience, is Paris in August 1914. A lot of ink has been spilled over that, and a lot of people have written about it. There were people coming from all over the place to join the Foreign Legion, and there were different nationalities that were sort of forming their own little groups to help out the French there in Paris. There were some Americans, and I detail this in my book, that there were, a decent number of Americans. There were students, art students, and university students there in Paris who felt an obligation. There were businessmen and travelers, and then there were just adventurers and those types that started coming together to do some training there in Paris. And by the time Kiffin and Paul got there, they arrived in Paris on August 26th and enlisted on August 27th. There was a group that had come together, the American Volunteers, and Kiffin and Paul ended up with that group, and they got sent out for some training right away, and they were stuck in a squadron with many other Americans that were grouped together. Interestingly, one of the Americans, and maybe this would be worth talking about at some point, would be Alan Seeger was in their squadron, and Alan Seeger, of course, became pretty famous as a poet. Maybe wrote one of the most famous poems in World War I called Rendezvous. And they ended up together. Kiffin, they went through training together, and it was pretty tough and rough and quick training, because at the beginning there, it looked like Germany was going to steamroll France and put an end to the thing. But they held up, and soon enough, the boys were pretty seasoned training-wise and were sent to the front. That's I guess I won't belabor the training there, but they did have sort of a rough go, and they did end up in the trenches as those sort of spread across the Western Front. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of soldiers who I almost said didn't make the cut, but that's not quite fair because it implies a weakness or something. And those trenches in World War One, if Paris was a place to look in on and want to be at the beginning, the trenches of World War One were a place to look in and not want to be. That had to be the worst place ever in the history of the world to exist, and yet these boys did that. And I call my book Kiffin Rockwell and the Boys Who Remembered Lafayette. And I don't go and belabor that point too much, but all of these boys at some point, I went through their diaries and their letters and all the correspondence and everything. And they all had this idea, most all of them anyway, that they owed something to France. And that's why they were there. They were not under any obligation whatsoever. And that's what's really remarkable about them, is that they were there enduring these things and going through these things just out of a sense of duty for what France had done for America long before they were ever born, and certainly under no obligation. And yet they withstood these things. So it's pretty remarkable.
So he's going to experience the trenches, and I imagine he sees combat as well.
Yeah, they ended up digging out these trenches, and so they did a lot of digging. And my book does kind of go into some of the day-to-day trench life and what they experienced and sort of the drudgery of it. And there's some funny parts. There was at one point a cow got shot. Like out in front of the lines or something, and Paul and some of the other soldiers slipped out there at night to carve up some of the cow, and they had steak for a couple days, and everybody thought that was great. And there's some things like that, but as far as the combat, this comes up in a lot of the memoirs and correspondence of the time, where they're trained and they're ready and they're sort of sitting in these trenches, and it almost drove people mad to just be like, let's go fight, or, let's do something. Like they couldn't take it anymore, especially when winter started setting in, and, the snow is coming down, and it started coming down in November, and things got cold and muddy and wet, and it had to be just awful. They didn't end up, they got sent up in some of the reinforcement lines and things like that. A couple people got shot when they, poked their heads out and things like that. And they had to go on these patrols, and that was always dangerous. They didn't end up in combat until they ended up in January of 1915 in a town called Crayonel. And that is something that also involved Alan Seeger, and maybe is something that we can talk about later on too.
So he experiences the trenches and everything that kind of goes with that. How does he end up then in the Lafayette Escadrille? How do we go from the trenches to being a pilot in this war?
Well, that's another sort of interesting thread that runs through the book, is that when World War One started, it was the trenches and the infantry charges, and shoot the other guy, and kind of almost like this idea of hand-to-hand kind of combat. Well, there was this relatively new idea slash thing, aviation, particularly with military applications. These planes are now coming to the fore and starting to be used for reconnaissance and to see, what's going on behind the lines, and that you could get a new perspective on things. Well, aviation starts to advance dramatically as a result of the conflict. And the boys down in the trenches can look up and see, their miserable existence compared to there's people flying overhead. And lots of people have commented on this, but I think just because it's true, that there was a big difference, at least in perception, between we're down here in the mud, there's people flying up there. And so some people wanted to get into aviation and to try to their hand at that. Another one of the boys that was in Kiffin's squadron was a Yale student named William Thaw, who became a pretty famous during the war and after the war. He was a pilot before the war. He had dropped out of Yale to fly like socialites around down in Palm Beach, Florida. And he was actually in France for a flight competition when the war broke out. And he offered himself as a pilot and offered his plane. And the French took his plane and said, "We'll take the plane, but we don't need any more pilots. And you can go in the Foreign Legion." So he and Kiffin became friends there. Well, ultimately, William Thaw worked his way into aviation through there was another American named Norman Prince who had this idea in America that he could get a squadron of Americans to fight for France and to volunteer that way. And he made his way to France in January of 1915 and started pushing this idea with the French authorities. Norman Prince came from a very prestigious and well-known and very, very wealthy family and had connections all over the place. And so he had the connections to try to push this idea. The French didn't go for it initially, but they did let him and Bill Thaw into aviation, and they started training. Eventually, Kiffin was wounded in a bayonet charge in May of 1915 and was sent to Paris to recover and encountered a woman there named Alice Weeks, who her son was also one of the Americans that had been in the Foreign Legion. And her son had gone missing in a charge with the same squadron and was missing. And so somehow Kiffin got hooked up with her in Paris, probably through Paul, who was now writing for the Chicago Daily News as a war correspondent. And she really took a liking to him. Her son had written letters to her about Kiffin and said, be nice to Kiffin if you ever meet him in Paris. Well, she was, and she took care of Kiffin, and she had actually was trying to get her son out of the trenches and had secured a spot for him to try to get into aviation training. Well, he went missing, and when Kiffin showed up and was good friends with him, she arranged that he could take her son's slot. So he did, and he eventually was transferred into aviation training in early September of 1915.
That's pretty incredible how all that worked out.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, there's so many different characters in this that come together, and that you can see where each of these boys where they came from, and that's one of the things that I think my book, it's not. I guess I'm patting myself on the back or whatever, because there's other books about all this, but it's sort of rehashes some of the same stuff, and you never get like the feel for like what happened in between, like what timing was all this? And I think my book sort of shows chronologically and like, here's this guy and here's how this guy came and here's how they made this connection and here's what was going on in the background. And it sort of contextualizes everything so that you can actually keep track of it in your head and see, oh, well, there was this connection and this was how this happened. And this was, Kiffin was kind of the Forrest Gump of World War I, like from the Foreign Legion to the squadron and everything in between. He was the sort of the central pivot on the hinge on which all this turned. He knew each of these people, like that when he was in the Foreign Legion, he knew these guys. When he transferred into aviation, he knew these guys, and everything that happened kind of went through him. So he was not just a remarkable individual, but a good vehicle through which to tell the story. And this story, even though the squadron is sort of well known, it's not as well known as it should be. And when people talk about America's entry into and its participation in World War I, they usually start with maybe the Lusitania or something, and then basically General Pershing coming in 1917 after the declaration of war. These boys were there from the very beginning and laid the groundwork and paved the way for all of that. And nobody really knows about it. They do know, and sees on like the aviation aspect, but nobody knows that there were all these Americans there fighting and laying this groundwork long before the troops came in numbers.
Well, and as you said, those relationships that they all had and when new people come in, I mean, it does flesh out the story in a way sometimes that dates and orders and numbers and things like that don't exactly do. So you mentioned kind of the composition of the Lafayette Escadrille. Can you just give us kind of a snapshot of the different types of young men that are in it? You know, are they all from the same socioeconomic class? Are they all from kind of the same background, or is it a very different group of people?
That's a fun part of this. The boys that made up the escadrille, there were seven of them originally. It was formed in April, officially formed in April of 1916, and they've ranged, I guess. Most of them came from a very wealthy, very privileged background. That would include William Thaw, who I mentioned, who not just went to Yale and was a pilot before the war, but was very wealthy. His father was a wealthy, I think, Pittsburgh banker, I think. Victor Chapman, who was one of Kiffin's best friends in the squadron, was the son of John J. Chapman, who was like the grandson, or maybe grandson or great grandson of John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and had helped with writing the Federalist Papers. And so, I mean, he came from a very blue blood background and money, lots and lots of money, and was another one of these idealists that thought that he needed to be there. Elliot Cowden was another one, and he was from a wealthy New York family and privileged. Norman Prince, who I mentioned, was fabulously wealthy and also had trained as a pilot before the war. Then you had, I mean, the remaining three were not as wealthy and privileged, and that would be Kiffin. And you know, he, like I said, he was raised by a single mother, but she put herself through medical school and became a physician. And so Kiffin had some money and had gone to college at Washington and Lee. He was probably middle class, or at least upper middle class at that time. But you notice in his correspondence and his letters, he did not come from money like these other guys. These other guys had a lot of money. Kiffin did not. Then you have Jim McConnell, who was probably in about the same circumstances as Kiffin, and he was quite a character. And he wrote his own book about all this called Flying for France, and was a great writer. And you read his book and you get a good feel for things too. He did not have a ton of money, but he was there for the adventure of it and to do what he thought was the right thing. And then the guy who always gets sort of the bad rap on all this was Bert Hall. He's always sort of given the side eye by everyone. That, you know, he was sort of this character that not quite sure where he was from. He never quite told the truth. He wrote bad checks, like particularly I noted in my research, he wrote a bad check to Norman Prince, which is kind of funny. But Bert Hall, I think, does get sort of put down, and maybe there's some justification for it, but he was a good pilot and a scrappy kind of guy. And he definitely did not come from privileged circumstances at all, and not even the same circumstances as Kiffin and Jim McConnell. But he was well liked by Bill Thaw. He had been in the Foreign Legion as well, and he was just one of these guys that was in the right place at the right time, and sort of was lucky enough to and plucky enough to make it through and actually do well. And I think that his service in the squadron, whatever anybody else wants to say about his character or anything else, I think he did a good job as a pilot.
Now, Kiffin is credited with being the first American to shoot down an enemy plane in World War One, and he was highly decorated by the French. What do we know about his war in the air?
Well, this was another of those interesting things that I confirmed, I guess, through my research for the book. One of the few things that I knew about Kiffin when starting off was that he was the first American to shoot down an enemy plane, and turns out that was not true. And another guy from the squadron who is also sort of put down a little bit and left out, Elliot Cowden, he actually was the first American to shoot down an enemy plane. I confirmed through looking at the French records, and they had all these records of each of the squadrons, This was right before the Escadrille Americaine, which it was originally called, the American Squadron. Right before that was formed in April of 1916, Elliott Cowden was serving with William Thaw in another squadron with the French, N65. N stood for Newport, and when the Escadrille Americaine was formed, its number was N124, which signifies that they're flying these Newport planes. Well, on April 4th of 1916, Elliott Cowden shot down a plane, and it was confirmed in a letter from William Thaw, and it was confirmed in the French records of the time. And he actually earned the Croix de Guerre as a result of that. And so when the squadron was formed, Elliott Cowden showed up, and this is why he gets sort of a bad rap sometimes, because when he showed up at the squadron in Luxeuil, France, he was just getting his new medal, and his chest was sort of puffed out, and he sort of rubbed people the wrong way, I think, at the way he came across. But he was actually the first American, and William Thaw had also earned the Croix de Guerre for his previous exploits, not in shooting down an enemy plane, although he apparently came very close at the same time, but for some bombing raids that he had done when he was flying a bomber. Kiffin was the first member of the squadron to shoot down a plane, and he did that in May of 1916 in Luxeuil, and he was the first member after the squadron was formed, and that made big news, and that's probably why he gets credit that way, because it was, news around the world, and certainly news in America when that happened, that this American pilot had shot down a plane as a part of the American squadron. And so that was big news, and everybody celebrated, and, the news went worldwide. And now that's what you always hear is Kiffin was the first pilot. And I don't, depending on how they word that, they may be right. I mean, if you carefully word it as Kiffin Rockwell was the first member of the squadron to shoot down a plane, that's accurate. But the first American to shoot down a plane in World War I was Elliott Cowden.
Many people are disillusioned by the experience of this war. And there are plenty of World War I memoirs where young men kind of enthusiastically march off to war. Then they experience the trenches or something similar, and that changes their attitude towards the war. There's also a prevailing myth that, and perhaps a perception, that the aviators, the knights of the air, as they're sometimes called, had a cleaner, more civilized war. Kiffin is somebody who's pretty unique. He experiences the trenches and the war in the air. How do these experiences change him? Does he ever lose his idealism?
That's a great way to ask that, because yeah, he did experience both, and certainly I would say some of the polish was knocked off. I would say that you can't go through some of these circumstances and not wonder what's the point of this. But Kiffin, from the beginning and even right to the end, always saw this as sort of a duty. And so no matter how hard it got, he was going to stick with it. And this kind of goes back to a point that I was making earlier. When he was in the Legion with Alan Seeger, who I mentioned earlier, and I mentioned that they had the combat in January of 1915. That was in Crayonnel, France, and they got transferred down to this new post where there was this old, like, burned out, bombed out shell of a chateau in France. And they hunkered down there and set up this base, and it was on that estate, and there was a big wall around the estate. And Kiffin and Alan Seeger got assigned to do guard duty by a shell had blown a big, huge hole in this wall, and it was sort of barricaded with chairs and maybe some logs and some wood and planks and stuff that they had stuck up there to barricade this wall. And Kiffin was assigned there. Alan Seeger was walking between the different sentries as the communication sentinel, and walks up shortly after Kiffin gets put on guard duty there. And they're standing there talking when a grenade gets tossed over the fence and lands between them, right between their feet. And Kiffin actually bends down and picks the grenade up. He didn't know what it was. And when he picks it up, Seeger shouts out, good God, that's a hand grenade. And Kiffin tosses it away and it doesn't go off. And that's kind of amazing, but that it didn't go off. But they also, they come to this sickening realization as they're standing there that the Germans are right there on the other side of this like makeshift kind of barricade thing. They don't know what to do. They're the only two soldiers there. They quickly converse, and Seeger runs back down the path to go get the corporal. And as the corporal comes running up, he and Seeger see some other hand grenades getting tossed over the wall and shout out to him to be on his guard. And sure enough, these grenades start going off. The Germans bust through this barricade, run in. The rest of the squadron is coming down. They start taking shots at them. People are falling and running, and they get sort of overrun. The Germans kill the corporal and bash his head in with the butts of their rifles and really like mutilate him. And it's kind of ugly. The squadron is scattered in the woods on this estate. Then the Germans retreat and go back up the hill on which they had been perched. And the Americans are sitting there kind of like wondering like what the heck just happened. And they hear this awful yell coming down from the hills that several of them described in their letters. And they said it was like this diabolical yell, this like horrible, awful yell. And they all noted how that sort of froze their blood and that they were like, this was the turning point kind of thing. And Kiffin did in his letter. And he wrote later, he wrote home to his sister just a few days after this. And here's what he said. The whole thing impressed all of us more like a murder than warfare. The Germans had no military point to gain by doing what they did. It was done as an act of individualism with a desire to kill. And then this was sort of the key, and this was what echoed the points of the other boys. Up until that minute, I had never felt a real desire to kill a German. Since then, I have had nothing but murder in my heart, and now, no matter what happens, I am going through this war as long as I can. Well, he did, and that was sort of the turning point in the trenches of like, I don't care what happens after this. They had killed the corporal. They felt sort of embarrassed that they had in their first big test they all felt like they kind of failed. And Seeger wrote, the poem that I mentioned that he wrote. I think I've convinced myself anyway that it arose from that incident when he was standing there on guard duty with Kiffin Rockwell. That poem, Rendezvous, begins, I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade, and goes on from there. And that poem went on to become President Kennedy's favorite poem. And I feel pretty certain that Alan Seeger was thinking of that night at the burned out chateau in Crayonel when he wrote that poem. And he stayed with it until he was killed on the 4th of July in 1916. And Kiffin stayed with it until he ended up getting shot down in September of 1916. But I think that neither of them ever actually fully lost their idealism. And maybe it was because, some of the men turned away from it because just the harshness of it. And some of them, it toughened them even more, where it toughened their resolve even more, where they said maybe they weren't idealists, but they were still sticking with their ideals to the end, and they were going to pay this debt no matter what it costs.
So you mentioned it just a little while ago, but Rockwell, he dies in action on September 23rd, 1916. Tell us about that final mission.
He had just shot down just before that. Kiffin, after Victor Chapman was killed that summer, was one of his best friends. He got killed. Kiffin strengthened his resolve even more, and he really was flying like a madman that summer, like just trying to avenge Victor Chapman, and came close to many other victories. Like he was credited with 4 and got his 4th on September 9th of 1916. And then this whole squadron had like a week in Paris, and that must have been a fun time too, because they really had like their first time off all together, and they spent it in Paris just enjoying life. And that was when the squadron is kind of famous for these 2 lion cubs, whiskey, and that they named Whiskey and Soda, and they got the first one there that week in Paris, whiskey was when they got that lion that they named Whiskey. And shortly after that was when they were transferred. When they returned to the front, they were sent back to Luxeuil, which was where they had originally been stationed. And now they had these new airplanes, the Newport 17 rather than the Newport 16, and these were faster, stronger, a new generation. And they also had what really excited Kiffin was they had a machine gun that could shoot through the propellers, a Vickers machine gun. Instead of just the Lewis machine gun up mounted on the wings, Kiffin's airplane actually had two machine guns. And so he was very excited to take it out. They only had ammunition for the Vickers machine gun for enough for two pilots. And Kiffin and Raoul Lufberry, who were the two senior pilots that were there, got the ammunition. They went out looking for some Germans on September 22nd, couldn't find any, came back. They both went out again on September 23rd, and Kiffin went out over the front, and there were some French officers that said they saw the fight. He attacked, as was his normal wont, straight ahead, coming straight at the pilot, but holding his fire till he got close enough. Well, the French officer said it looked like they were going to collide, and he couldn't tell what had happened. And then it was apparent that Kiffin's plane had gotten shot. One of the wings fell away, and it just twisted down, and he actually crashed not far from Luxeuil. And so that was Kiffin had fulfilled his mission, quest, pledge, whatever you want to call it. He had given his life, and as I like to think, like he did pay that debt that he felt was owed, and that many Americans by that time. And this had kind of shifted public opinion with the way these boys were over there and getting covered in the press and everything else, that many Americans were coming to the same conclusion that we owed this debt and that these boys were over there repaying it. And so that was the end of Kiffin Rockwell, but it was not the end of the Americans in France.
A very short life, but a very significant life, I think. Any final thoughts about Kiffin Rockwell, his legacy?
He is an idealist. He's somebody who should be remembered. I think that most Americans, we should remember the name Kiffin Rockwell, and it's unusual enough that it's easy to remember, but it should be one that people are familiar with and familiar with what he did. As I mentioned just a minute ago, the end of Kiffin was not the end of the Americans. It was really the beginning, because his death sort of precipitated a chain of events that led, I can't say give full credit to that, but it certainly was further accelerant or further fuel for America entering the war. There were many in Germany at that time who wanted to resume this unrestricted submarine warfare, and they put out past the censors in Germany, who had been sort of censoring American involvement. They got it into the press, and all over Germany, the death of Kiffin Rockwell was a big story. And they were trumpeting the fact that, hey, Kiffin Rockwell died, but guess what? Everybody knows Kiffin Rockwell was an American, and that he was fighting as part of an American squadron in France. And America is supposed to be neutral. And so they filed diplomatic protests, and this was just a big storm in the press coverage. And President Wilson was running for re-election, and his big thing was he kept us out of war. And this was not anything that they wanted to deal with. And so they had to handle all this controversy coming out. They started pressing France right around the election time to get rid of this American squadron, call it something different. And they did. They initially proposed the volunteer squadron, and nobody liked that, so it didn't take. And then they came up with the perfect name that everybody agreed on, the Lafayette Escadrille, the squadron of Lafayette. Kiffin did have that impact on getting America, I think, the American public preparing their minds for the fact that we would end up in the war, and then sort of catalyzing, or I'd say galvanizing, American public opinion to support it even after President Wilson got reelected. And so when Germany did resume the unrestricted submarine warfare. It was a much shorter step to take to say, all right, we need to get over there and we need to do something about this. And I think that's Kiffin's legacy, I would say, is that he stood on principle, he stood on his ideals, and showed that one person can actually make a difference in world affairs. And he wanted to pay this debt, and I think he did pay the debt.
The book is A Destiny of Greatness, Kiffin Rockwell and the Boys Who Remembered Lafayette. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.